searching for new approaches to welfare reform and sustainable society. And with Henrietta, you started the IGP Social Prosperity Network, which I think has driven a really impressive body of new ideas and new concepts, and in particular, the development of the Universal Basic Services report that was coming. Andrew, that would be fantastic.
Good to see everybody here. Thanks for coming along. My first note should really be a deep gratitude to Henrietta Moore and the IGP for agreeing to embark on this research project. One of the exciting things is that UBS has attracted interest and a certain degree of support quite often from both the left and the right end of the political spectrum. So it's definitely excited something, and I think that part of that is because people are looking at new ideas. I think that a lot of people are aware that where we're set up today and going into the future, there's a mismatch, and so there is an openness to new ideas. This is a definition which I had the luxury of writing, of Universal Basic Services, because the work that we're doing here at IGP is effectively the first time that this idea is out in the wild, so to speak. So we have the luxury of sort of defining it as we go along. I see someone taking photographs, so I'll just make a quick mention that we will post the whole slide deck and all of the references and materials online at igpspn.org. So if you want to go there afterwards, it's not there right now. The report is there right now. Now I think, more useful perhaps than just the sort of dry definition of what we mean by UBS is, what is the question that we're trying to answer? And I think I see this as a question that is going on in countries across the world. As we get into the 21st century, how are we going to be able to deliver what is essential social support to keep our societies together, cohesive, operating as human societies do well, and how can we afford to do that from the available revenues or resources that are in? So I think that's the big question that is floating over politics, over economics, and UBS is an answer to that. And before I go on to what I think our answer to that, I'll point out that we're also guided by another UCL professor who about 16 years ago, for all I know, possibly in this room, came up with this notion of an iron triangle. So Richard Blundell, who was here and at IFS, said if you're going to look at welfare reform, you've got to do these three things. Right? You have got to meet the needs, you've got to control cost, and you have to preserve incentive. And that is an iron triangle that we have accepted as part of this report. And then I'll say one more thing, because I forgot to say it earlier. So this report, which is, there's a copy of it here, how many Patrick has left, that came out in October, is a collaboration, partly between Henrietta and myself, because we started the Social Prosperity Network, but also two economists that were involved in helping us look in the details of the economic analysis, but also to set the big picture. Howard Reed, who is an independent economist and has worked at various think tanks, but he has a very good and detailed model of the impact of the welfare system on different types of households in the UK economy. So he did the modeling for us. And the other person was Jonathan Portes, who is now at King's College as a professor. He was at NISA, and before that was at Department of Work and Pensions, and was a big part of the team that put in sort of income credits, income supplement here in the UK back in the 90s. So the report is by all three of us, and we're all three on board, and so you can sort of imagine two extra people here, although I'm the one who's talking to you today. And we all accept this sort of iron triangle as a condition of getting there. So I think the best way to describe Universal Basic Services is that it's a change. It's a change in direction. That instead of looking at using cash distribution as a way of compensating people for costs, we look directly at reducing cost. And that is a sort of dramatic and different approach to how to deal with welfare the cost of living in a modern society. And the way that we're doing that is that we're moving the needle from benefits and cash distribution over towards services. So, we accept that there's no such thing as there's never going to be a social security system that is 100%, we don't have one in the UK, 100% cash, or 100% services. This is going to be a mixed economy, to mix metaphors, of both. You're going to need some of each of those in the component. But what we're proposing to do is to move the context. So instead of talking in the UK, we have the NHS and we have educational services, but the rest of it we do with cash distribution. To move that over so that the first thing we think of when how to deliver social safety and support in our society is, can we deliver that as a service? And then we use cash as a backup for that. So I think that's sort of the biggest meaning of of what it is about universal basic services that's different. Now, we're also concerned, there's a softer side to this, I should say, I guess. And it's not just soft. It is, and I'm quoting here from Roberto Unger, if any of you have known him or watched any of his lectures, if you can get through them, they are incredibly tough. I highly recommend him. He's an American professor, UNG. And Roberto Unger would say that the primary purpose of government is to enact structural change, and that the most important structural change the government can deliver is to act at the bottom of society. That most of the middle of society can take care of itself, and it operates very well. In fact, most of it operates better without government intervention. But where government can be most effective is in creating this floor in society. And the reason that I think that I agree with him on that is that there's this element of fear and anxiety and the impact that that has on individuals and then on the whole of society. And so in a modern 21st century knowledge-based economy, that's an unhelpful way to motivate people. And we are much more likely to be more productive, more cohesive, if we can take some of the fear out of society. So there's that element to universal basic services. Now we make a number of claims in the report, and I'll come back to these and explain a little bit after I've done this next one. Because what I want to do first is set some context. So some people would say that we, as authors of this report, have taken a relatively conservative approach. That is, you will not find any quote-unquote modern monetary theory in what we're proposing. We have accepted certain constraints, economic constraints, on the area within which we can operate. And what I want to do is explain something about why we've adopted those, what we think is credible about that, and that then influences what options you think are possible for the future. So I'm going to run through this, and the first thing I want to do is sort of put us on a timeline. So I'd ask you to sort of zoom out and imagine now you've got this timeline in front of you. We're going to do 300 years of British history on a single chart. And you can see over this that the main things that have happened is we've been through these big economic revolutions. Now these are, in fact, this is a sort of passageway or a pathway that just about every country in the world has now joined, which we entered very early on. The nice thing about putting us on that is that we've got quite a lot of data from that sort of period. So the first thing that I want to look at within that is life expectancy. So this is uncontroversial and statistical. So the top line is life expectancy over that period of time in the UK. Understand there's some obviously issues with any statistic, but we're after a broad brush here. And the bottom blue line is a rough approximation of the age at which you can enter productive work. So I know the Romans sent sort of 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds into the Spanish silver mines but we're sort of past that. We were past that probably in 1750, luckily. But you probably could have entered work in your early teens. Today, many of you are still preparing and in education to get to a point where you are into what would be called the productive portion. So these two lines, if you add them up together, and there's sort of a notable blip here, right, where the effects of a better healthcare system start to kick in, and you could map pretty much any society over this same sort of timeline, depending on when they started into it. There is an age at which productivity starts to go down. This is probably the least controversial way I can say it. And if you can just take this period of time where someone is young and this period of time where they're past retirement and add those together and then do it as a proportion of the amount of time here, we can see that there are going to be some changes as we go along. So this is that line accumulated. And I'll point out three things that are, I think, fairly obvious in the line itself. But that somewhere around the middle of your technical period, so after you've been through your Industrial Revolution and now you've started to have better healthcare systems, there's a period of time where you extend everybody's lives, average lifetimes, but you're extending it within their productive period. So if in 1900 we go from 49 to by 1950 average lifetimes are 70, you've substantially basically added to the productive lifetime of your population. Between 1950 and 2000, it goes from 70 to 81. And so you're not adding as productive a time to that. But it means you get this little dip, and then it goes up after a bit. And you'll notice here that somewhere in the next few decades, we'll probably cross a halfway point, where people are spending half of their lives either old or young and preparing for work. Now, we just sort of file that way as a rough approximation of, it's one way of sort of estimating what the total level of social support is needed in a society. And what I want you to take away rather than any of the details on this is that this changes over time. And we can't look back at policies that might have worked in the 50s, 60s, or 70s and say that we can just apply those into the future. And you also notice that this line has more to go into the future. So another thing I'll map over this timeline, and this time I've taken out the UK because actually this is something that's affected by lots of different countries. This is the cost of resources, and I use that in the most general terms, so not just materials, but also the energy that we use to drive our economy. The cost of a resource has three components. There's the cost of getting it out, extracting it from the ground if you need to, and somehow getting it into use. There's a cost associated with competitive use, by which I mean that if there are two possible uses for something, you can get some competition that is in the price for that resource. There's also competition between societies. So part of the fact that the reason that this line has gone up over time is that as more and more countries enter into their own industrial, technical, and information cycles, they become competitors for the same resources that everybody else is trying to get to. And then there's a third component to the cost of a resource, and that's its waste. So when we burn oil, we get a waste product, that's carbon. And when we reach a certain point in our society, we will start to build that cost into the purchase price of the resource. But the reason there's a question mark on the end of this is we haven't done that yet. There is no carbon tax that is generically adding to the cost of these kind of resource uses. And it's quite likely that at some point, actually, in the next 40 or 50 years, that line is going to have to go above 100 to recoup some of what we haven't paid for in the past. So climate mitigation costs are basically going to be a sort of back payment on unpaid past waste costs. Now, don't have to have the detail here. I'm just trying to establish some broad principles of what's going on in our society. I got a note here, one more quote from, there's a lovely chap called Amory Lovins, who is one of the world's experts on energy and efficiency, and he runs something called the Rocky Mountain Institute. And if you have any interest in environmental future and how we're going to manage our future energy grid or any of that stuff, look up the Rocky Mountain Institute, because they advise governments across the world. They're amazing, and it was started by Amory. And I had the pleasure of going to a seminar that he ran in California a few years ago. And one of the points that he made was that there's something that we don't see, that's just sort of not so obvious to us as we sit in the middle of our particular situation. But we are moving, certainly in the West and the developed worlds, from a situation where a few decades ago the expensive resource was humans and the cheap resources were materials, to a place where it's going to be the other way around. We are going to be the cheap resources, and it's the materials that are going to be expensive. And I think that's something well worth thinking about, but it's sort of reflected in this as well. Now, and believe me, this gets less complicated as we go into this presentation, but I want to take you through this bit. There's another component. I call it commercial intensity, but it doesn't have to be kind of that complicated, really. What we're talking about here is not so much the price of anything, but what portion of the activity in your economy do you put a price on? So when you're living in an agrarian environment, purely with your family and a few related families, you're not paying each other to do anything for each other. You may be getting your water for free down the road. I'm sort of creating an example to give you an idea of what might be a zero commercial intensity situation. But there are a number of things that happen as any country goes through its three revolutions, through its industrial, technical, and information revolution, which is more and more of the activity gets a price put on it. If any of you took the IGP's GDP seminar, or if you sort of keep track of this, GDP is the new dirty word, right? It's the bad measurement, because it includes everything, whether the activity is helpful or whether it is the ambulance taking a wounded person. This all adds to GDP. But in fact, in this case, this is roughly what I'm talking about, partly, is that the more that there is activity in our society that we attach a value to, and it's driven partly by specialization. I'm a computer guy, I don't know how to fix my shoes, I pay someone else to fix my shoes, I don't know how to grow my food. Do you know what I mean? This goes on and on. That's a fairly starting point. We live in large urban societies where you probably live yards from strangers and miles from family. So the support and services that you're going to get in your life are probably going to have to pay for it and get it from a stranger. And we looked at real resource costs earlier. So this is something that has happened over time and continues to this day. And we're, I think, at a fairly high level of commercial intensity now. We're not quite at the point where everyone wants to be paid for every single thing they do all the time, but we are living in quite diverse, separated urban environments. All of that is quite peaceful. There's some good things that go on in this. Commercial intensity is a good thing, specialization. But just to note that it does, this is what's sort of happening. We attribute monetary value to more and more things in our society. Now, on its own, that's an isolated sort of academic notion. But this is why it's important. That governs the tax rate. If we need to provide social support, and all of that social support can be provided by your family members for free, there's no need to raise any taxes. But if we move forward into a large society where we don't have access to those sort of familial networks of free services, then we're dependent on a public service. Public service is provided by us as a community, but people are paid to do that. And the materials that are used in that are paid for. So what this means is that not only do we have over time an increasing social need for support in our society, but as commercial intensity goes up, so does the tax rate needed to raise that. This is a constraint that we kind of accepted as part of our report. We didn't go into it as it didn't fit in the report, but I'll give you an idea of how we think of things. So this blue line is the social age line that we had from before, rough proxy of demand. The red line is if you take the commercial intensity and apply it by that, then you get roughly what a tax rate has to be in an economy to raise enough money to pay for the social support. So if we just map the UK's public expenditure onto that from 1900 through to 2000, we can see this is not a bad approximation. This actually roughly kind of fits with what's really going on out there. So, you know, I'll mention in brief, because this is the right place to do it, there have been some phrases that have come up in society, in politics I think more, but in society over the last few years, and two of them. One of them is big society, if those of you remember that from sort of 2010, 11, 12. Another one that does the rounds is co-production. I don't know if you've heard either of those, but what I find interesting about those is that I don't think they consciously realize it, the people who've coined those phrases, but what they're starting to talk about is the need to reduce commercial intensity in order to deliver these social services. Big society idea was effectively David Cameron and the early Conservative government's idea that through volunteering we would meet some of these needs, and by somehow enabling massive volunteering this would make our society poor. And you know, it didn't work and it wasn't going to, and they're not paying attention to why it is that people would make social effort. But it's interesting that it's part of the conversation, that people are recognizing it. Whether they've done this analysis or not, there is some creeping recognition that social effort, not just taxes, are going to have to play a part in our future. So, if taxes are how we do public support, and they are, this is a pie chart that gives you an idea, because what I'm going to say is our government is largely a social support organisation. 80% of what the government spends its money on is direct social support. That's all the blue sections in here. I'm quite sure what to do with other and EU, but some of that probably is social. Defence isn't, right? Industry, agriculture, and employment, there's probably some social in there as well. But even if you take that, the vast majority of what our government spend their time and energy and effort on, and they are funded by our taxes, is social support. Pensions, healthcare, education, these are all direct social support services. So I'm going to go forward on this on the proxy that the amount we spend publicly is largely an idea of how much we're spending on social support services. So, how much money is available for the government? And I find that this is an area of debate that gets really confused. And it starts with someone saying, well, I've got this great new idea for a tax. Or I've got this idea. I was at a talk the other day where someone said that they had reviewed 108 government regulations, and they figured that if they reformed those, they would liberate £400 billion. So, in that environment, it's very hard to have the conversation. Well, sorry, wait a minute, but the government says there's no money available, and this guy's saying we could change 100 regulations and get 20% of GDP? There's a way of cutting through this without getting into the minutiae of whether that particular idea of how to raise that tax, could we up council tax, could we reduce this, could we tax wealth? There's another way to look at this, and I call it super macro. And what I'm going to propose is that if you look across the world, and you just look at different societies, and you ask yourself, how much do they tax? Can we not reasonably assume that dozens and dozens of different societies and countries in different situations over the years might have arrived at some empirical ideas that we can use to give us an idea of how much money is actually available? So look at taxes not as this tax or that tax, but as an overall proportion of GDP. And I know GDP is a bad word, but one of the funny things about this is that GDP was invented by a bunch of economists who were looking to measure fiscal tax activity. So it's actually very, very relevant and useful for this. So if you do this and you go across the world and you can collect the stats, Heritage Foundation has some, EU has some, OECD has some, you can look at how much different societies around the world are taxing themselves. And what's the answer? So without meaning to steal from the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the answer is 42. That is the average of the EA19 in here. And it's not just across Europe. If you take the top 25 countries in the OECD and you average out their tax rate, it's 42%. There's some variables here. The US is a really hard one to do because most of the people who do the statistics only count federal taxes in the US. They don't do state taxes. And state taxes can be 50% on top of that again. Not 50% literally, but another 10 or 12%. So it's quite actually difficult to throw the US into these. But even if you include the US, we're at 40%. What I hope this does is this gives you an argument that when someone stands up and says, oh, that's a great idea for what we can do in our country. We can reform 108 regulations and we can raise £400 billion and this is how we're going to spend it. That you're going to say to yourself, well, wait a minute, what do we spend today? Oh, we're already spending 41%. And this proposal adds 20%. There isn't a country in the world that is raising 60% of their economic output in taxes. So I hope that what that does is give you some idea of a nice simple way to evaluate it when people say, oh, I found this new source of money. I would argue, and we would argue, well, if it doesn't fit within the parameters that exist today, at least admit that you are proposing something that no one is doing, that no society anywhere on the planet so far has figured out is the right way to do it. So I'm not saying anything's impossible, it's all possible. But it may be very, very unlikely. So if we map that line onto our UK history that we were looking at earlier, we can see this is an interesting period to be alive. That we are spending 41%, it's pretty close to that 42 kind of average. And we know two things about the future. We're going to have more old people and resource costs are going to go up. So we need solutions for social support in our society, we would argue in this report, that are realistic, that they fit within these constraints, that these are real constraints. I'm not one who buys that any human society is going to sustain a 60% tax rate. I think there's a reason that it's in the mid to low 40s on average for most countries in the developed world. And you can look at it from a sort of super micro perspective and say, well, if you're being paid and you have to pay more than half of that in tax, what effect does it have on you? And I would argue that fairly simply it results in one of two things, possibly both. One is there's a reduction in motivation. So countries find that if they up their tax rates too much, people just kind of stop working so hard. And the economy doesn't do so well, the country doesn't do so well. The second thing that can happen is that the motivation to avoid taxes goes up. So either way, you get either a smaller economy or you get more corruption. And that's why it turns out that human societies across the planet don't go much above this sort of 42, 43, 44%. Denmark's at 50%, but they're very small and they're very sort of homogeneous. France is at 45%. So there are countries that are higher than we are, but they're not, it's not, you know, which 2, 3, 4% maybe is available to spend. So that's a constraint we accepted in this report. And I think that is you know, the fact that we accepted that makes this a little different than one of the other, some of the other things that people have proposed. So let's look at what we think the components that need to be in social support consist of. I think this is a pretty uncontroversial list, it's modeled on a 21st century economy and society. So it's moving beyond just what is people's physical safety, their health, but also includes opportunity through education and their ability to participate in a free and open democracy and in the economy of knowledge, to communicate, to be on the internet, to be digitally connected. So these are the 7 services. that we include in the definition of what universal basic needs are. And then in the UK, we already do 3 of these as a service. We do education and healthcare and legal services, which is a sort of bucket into which we don't just put legal aid, but the cost of the democracy itself, the protection services, fire, police, that kind of stuff. So these are all delivered, paid for out of taxes and delivered as services. You don't have to pay when you go through the school gate, and you don't have to pay when you go to the doctor. The other 4 is what we've modelled in our report. So if we take the total set of basic needs that should at least some people have access to, and I'll use this as a moment to say, you know, the proper name says a proposal for universal basic services on here, right? What it probably should say, the accurate one, would be a proposal for universal access to basic services. Right? We're not actually proposing that everybody live in social housing, or that everybody uses the bus, right? What we're proposing is that that access should be available to everybody when they need it. There are certainly issues in here, and you know, parts of the critique of the report where the allocation of resources, particularly scarce resources. But anyway, so access to shelter, food, and transport is what we modelled. And what we're trying to answer, the question here is, how much does that cost? And does it fit into the wriggle room that is available from our super macro analysis of how much money could possibly be raised in total? What I want to point out here is we didn't shy away from nice, bold gestures of what it would take to really get social safety, security, to take fear out of our society. We modelled 1.5 million housing units. That's roughly the shortfall in builds that is estimated in the UK from recent decades. And we did that without any compensatory, oh, well then we're going to rent them out or sell them or whatever it is. We said, no, we're going to build them and we're going to deliver them for free, along with utilities and no council tax. Now, whether you'd actually do that is not the point. The point here is, what we're trying to do is we're trying to drive out what is the cost of delivering a proper social security system in the 21st century, and we wanted to be as open about that as possible. So that's it on housing. On the food side, we looked at 3 different options. What would it take to replace food bank use, which gets a lot of press and there's a lot more of it, and it's an indicator of a problem in our society. But actually it does not cover food insecurity. Food insecurity is better measured. There's a Food Standards Authority survey which they do, and one of the questions they go into people's houses and they sit down at their kitchens and they talk to them. And one of the questions they ask is, have you in the last year had difficulty putting food on the table for you and your family? The answer to that is yes, by about 4 million people in this country. So we took that number and we said, okay, well, how do you know? I mean, well, maybe we could do 1/3 of the meals for 4 million people. That's 1.8 billion meals a year. I'm trying to point out to you, these are not small, tiny little services that we modeled in this. This is a properly expansive program, were you able to implement it. What we did on transport is we took the Freedom Pass, which is what everybody over the age of 62 in the country gets, which is basically free local transport, and we gave that to everybody. What would it cost to give that to everybody? And I'll point out that we recognise that transport services have been driven into the ground in a lot of parts of the country, so we 2.5 times the budget for local transport to make sure that there was money available to actually run rural bus services where they have been withdrawn in recent years. And then on the information side, we said, okay, well, how about a basic level of cell phone service that everybody gets, and it's uncancelable. If you might buy your extra gigabytes of data and whatever else, but if you don't pay that bill, the cell phone company can't cut you off. You are at least still connected. You can call for that next job interview. You can make your doctor's appointment. You've got a level of service which is uncancelable, maybe basic. And we did broadband internet across the country, and we cancelled the BBC TV license.
Conrad wants Netflix.
Yeah, why not Netflix instead of
Yeah, well, you need broadband, but yeah. There's no Netflix. So hopefully you'll agree what I'm trying to say here is this is an expansive set of services. I mean, we would transform society if we did this. Right? We would truly be delivering access to universal basic services. And the point here was for us to drive at the cost. There's a whole raft. I mean, if you're looking for a subject for your dissertation, I can't imagine that there aren't 100 different things in the talk that I've given today that need further research, that need to be looked at in more detail. And one of those is the allocation of all of these. But this is what it costs, 2.3% of GDP. Those little yellow slices that you see in there are the extra costs of all the services that I just went through on the previous slide, compared to the UK budget today. It's actually not outside of the bounds of reason. This is an achievable objective that would be transformational in our society. I don't take away from 2.5% of GDP, that is half of your personal allowance. If you pay taxes in this country, you get 11.5 grand a year, which you don't have to pay tax on. So this would cut that down by more than half, actually, to about 4,300. The average person in the higher ends of the income scale is going to pay 20 quid a week to enable this. I think that's worth it. But my point then, the point of the report, was to answer this question, because when you say to people, hey, you know what, I've got this idea of universal basic services, so instead of actually dishing out cash and doing cash distribution, we could actually deliver these services. And people go, oh, that's crazy, that costs too much money. Now we have the numbers. I think that's probably the biggest contribution, and that's why it can open up this debate and say, okay, now we can talk about this, and we're not crazy. So I'll now talk a little bit about what I think is different at the sort of on top of all of that. The fact is this is a solution, and it can fit, and we can do it, and it's practical. I want to talk about some sort of excitingly different parts of the way UBS works, and hopefully open up the imagination a little bit on what's possible here. Again, we're not replacing 100% of cash in this, and I'll make that point. So we didn't change any of the benefit system when we did that analysis, with the exception of one thing. So the people who moved into the social housing, the 1.5 million social housing units we built, we didn't pay them housing benefit on top. But that is the only change to the welfare system that we made. We left everything else in place. This is an analysis by Howard on the distributional impact of these services on different groups of people. So these charts all start with the poorest 10% of the population down there and the richest 10% of the population. And they give you an idea of the impact. Now, these were services that we allocated mostly to the people at the bottom end of our society. So I'm going to talk a lot about this first column. There's an effect, which was called the social wage effect, and the earliest reference I've come across from that is a Labour politician, she's called Barbara Castle, for those of you who know her, in the 1970s, who used this to describe the effect of social public services. That what they do is they effectively replace cost. It's kind of like getting paid. And that these services that we've modelled, which are just, so this is just the housing, the transport, the food, and the information, not the healthcare, the education, are worth a lot to people who actually use those services. 126 quid a week, which to someone in the lowest earnings brackets in this is like getting an 80% pay raise. It makes a huge difference to people's cost of living. We haven't actually handed anybody any cash. What we've done is we've replaced cost in their lives. And this is a fundamental difference that services deliver. Particularly when we think of something that you read about more and more nowadays, is that there are a lot of people in the UK that we classify as in poverty are also in work and or have precarious work environments. So hopefully I got too much effort to understand that this kind of impact because a lot of those people are at the lower end of the income deciles. This kind of service, alleviation of cost for them, can have a major impact on the quality of lives for those kinds of people. There's a second part to this same thing, which is that it doesn't actually cost us £126 to deliver those values. Those are the replacement cost values to the person. So instead of them having to pay rent, they're getting the housing, right? So instead of having to buy this meal for the kids, they're actually getting that done. But there's a difference between what it costs for a private individual to buy something and what it costs for public provision. If we were talking about taking startups now, we would be calling this the sharing economy. And we would all get it, wouldn't we, right? There's a reduction in cost because we've shared resources between us and a bit more efficient use out of the resource. And that's kind of what public provision does. That when a big organization like the government sort of enters into a marketplace and starts to do things, you can get access to cheap money, you can bulk purchase, you can do a lot of things that's more efficient. So in our estimate, that actually to deliver that £126, it costs 83. There's a savings here. And who does that savings accrue to? It accrues mostly to the government. And it increases, what it does is, if you refer back to it, it reduces commercial intensity in our society, which reduces the tax rates. But more importantly, what I want to point out here is you can't get that effect if what you do is you go to someone who's living in this environment and you say, okay, well, I want to give you some money so that you can buy housing and food and information. It's going to cost you 126. But if you actually deliver those, instead of trying to compensate someone, so instead of using the benefit system or basic income or some cash distribution to try and compensate people, if you actually do the work and deliver the service, you can yield a saving. That's only available in a service-based system. This potentially, and this is the stuff that I think is most exciting and I'd love to spend some time on as we go into the next stage of the research, is the extent to which this changes the private economy. Because you have the potential here to enable a whole raft of what I would call micro businesses. There are lots of businesses, many of them beginning with re, right? Repair, reuse, retrofit. A lot of them are environmentally very beneficial and that we would want to encourage. But they operate on much smaller margins. They're only going to happen if we can reduce costs across the board. And if what we're doing is delivering a set of services that have reduced people's cost of living, then more people can afford to deliver these kind of highly specialized, very localized, might be caring services, there might be any of those re-services that I talked about. But there's a possibility that it would enable a whole lot of sort of non-corporate micro activity. I'm probably using a lot of long words to explain to someone who in 1917, 20 or something would have just said, oh, you mean you're like doing the stuff that we do every day, right? Fixing things and taking care of ground. But we can enable a lot of that activity, I think, by reducing people's cost of living. Now, it's a common critique from a certain spectrum of the left that says that, well, you know, all we've done with income credits, for instance, is we've subsidized the corporations, right? Because we're basically giving them cheap labor and we as a taxpayer is taking it on. Well, I mean, the bad news here is that's what public spending is. I mean, that's what the healthcare system is. In the NHS, I mean, the UK, you go and hire an employee, you don't have to add on $1,000 a month to pay for healthcare, which is what you have to do in the States. Anything that you do, that you spend as a government, as a society, to reduce people's cost of living or to take a burden off their shoulders, has the potential impact of benefiting the employers in that same society because it reduces labor costs. So actually you can't put that label on this service or that service, they all do. And actually, it's a great thing. Potentially it makes our businesses more competitive on the world stage. So that is an impact of any kind of benefit or welfare system It's exaggerated with universal basic services because we get that bigger kick. We get the £126 impact instead of just the £83. And I personally think that, subsidizing the bottom rather than the top, meaning, facilitating a reduction in cost in average employees' lives is a more effective way of subsidizing the business environment than trying to do corporate welfare directly and giving them subsidies through it. Because what it then means is the marketplace has to compete for the available resources that are liberated by that activity that you've done. You don't have to pick winners, you don't have to pick industries in the same way. And then the quality of motivation, obviously it increases bargaining power, but pretty much all welfare systems do, basic income would as well. If I don't have to take this job to feed my kids, then my bargaining power has been increased. And certainly universal basic services, the access to those would increase your bargaining power in that situation. I think it's really important because in a 21st century economy, the sort of knowledge economies that we work in, the type of motivation that people are operating from makes a difference to how productive they are. And I would argue that if what you're doing is you're doing something because you don't want to be destitute and have your children starve, that is a different motivation than saying, oh, I think that what I'm really good at is this and I'm going to go and do that. But the second option is the more productive option that yields a better economy. I think this is a point that's too often too easily missed by certain groups of people, but anyway, I'll come back to that in the questions. I'm nearly there. They meet needs very directly. So I'm going to use the example of the bus pass if we run through this, right? Is that I can give everybody in this room a free Oyster card for the next year, and when are you going to use it? When you need to travel somewhere, unless you're like my son who's so in love with the tube, he'd probably sit on it on purpose for days. But most people will use the service at the time that they need to do the thing that it is that you're offering. So giving everybody an Oyster card is almost costless, right? But it enables access to that service at exactly the point of need. So you normally use a bicycle, you don't use that, you wake up in the morning, someone stolen your front wheel, and you can jump on the tube, or you can jump on the bus. So I'm using sort of fairly sort of straightforward examples here, but this accrues to services particularly, that you can enable a broad set of access to services and that those get employed. And this is the way the NHS works, right? I mean, we all have access to the NHS, but you don't go in until you're sick. There are plenty of places where cash distribution doesn't work, and it isn't working today. I've got 100 children here. I mean, the thing with children is that nobody in the world is proposing a welfare system which pays benefits to children, right? We all, if you're going to distribute cash, you give it to adults, right? 4 or 5-year-old. But you can give access to a community canteen or whatever your version of various of these services are to anybody. It doesn't carry the same energy, weight, responsibility. So my sister-in-law was a big fan of that one. Hungry children are something that you can deal with in a service that you just, if you're doing cash distribution, you cannot get the same level of effectiveness, the same level of penetration. Sometimes cash just makes it worse, right? We've got a complete mess of a housing market in this country. And if your answer to that is, well, we're going to sort of give some people some more money so that they can maybe get on that ladder, you get sort of help to buy, and the whole thing sort of gets worse and worse. So when the market has failed, adding more cash to the fire doesn't really help. So there are certainly instances where services can meet a need directly and do so much better than cash. And then something that we do acknowledge in the report, right, which is, this is all fine, I'm saying let's move to services, but let's also acknowledge that means more work. It's harder work. You've actually got to do it now. So much easier to pay someone £8 and say, go feed yourself, than it is to take that £8 and actually turn that into a meal. That's the downside. The positive side is, once you've done that work, you have built social fabric. You have added social capital to your community and to your society that will make it more resilient. So there is, you know, that's probably the big one in universal basic services. We need, a lot of these services will need to be designed and delivered locally. And in order to do that, we're going to have to work harder and be prepared to do that, not just hand off remote hands, here's a cash payment, but actually roll our sleeves up and do some of this stuff. But the good side of that is that you'll be building social institutional fabric that has been eroded probably too far in our society, as most people would agree. So, that's what I think is exciting about universal basic services. I think that it fits, that we can do it. It's not a pie-in-the-sky idea. It is an idea of what to do with money we haven't raised yet, and I'm conscious of that one. So, you know, taxes would have to change. But it's not outside of the bounds. It's possible to do, and it would be truly transformative, and it would fit with the 21st century world. It can have an effect on reducing long-term caring costs. It can reduce costs in our economy. It can potentially hold tax rates to within reasonable distances, even with the future things that we know are coming down the turnpike. And I think it meets Richard Blundell's iron triangle, right? That it meets needs, it controls costs, and it preserves motivation. So that's my spiel. I hope that was something.